What we're going to do today is start applying some of what we've learned. And the way you do that is you try to understand how people used what they thought they knew about nuclear energy and deterrence and military planning to set international limits on some of these activities. And what you'll find is not all of the people, even the smartest people, had a grasp of what they were talking about. And the reason it's useful to go over this history is perhaps to avoid some of the misunderstandings that occurred in the past, on the one hand. On the other hand, some of the things that they hit upon were profoundly correct. And some of that is what we no longer remember. And so that also is another reason to look back. Um, I think one wag put it, why do we bother with history if we're concerned about the future? The answer is it's all we have. It isn't because it's great, it's because it's all we've got. And it's a mistake not to look at it. So, I guess the other apologia for looking at past efforts at international control is diplomacy when it comes to humans is a little bit like breathing. It's natural. And there's a lot of people, particularly on the right, very familiar with these folks because I'm on the right, will argue, oh, well, arms control never works or doesn't work or hasn't worked. Now, as far as hasn't worked, I think there's a lot of reason to say there's something to that. But what they don't properly appreciate is that it will happen. In the lead up, I did not thoroughly understand this myself until recently. Normally, if you study World War One, you know there were a lot of diplomatic arrangements that were supposed to deter war and prevent any nation from having an advantage, and all of that broke down because it was so complex. Nobody could keep track of exactly what would happen, and in fact, that diplomacy accelerated the onset of the war in some respects, or aggravated it. So that's the usual argument about World War One, that we were a little too clever by half as to what we thought we could do with diplomacy. You don't hear so much about that with regard to World War II. But in fact, the same thing happened there as well. There were a lot of diplomatic things that you don't read much about. Here's an item: Poland struck a deal with Hitler right before the war, non aggression pact. Well, that didn't quite work. There were non aggression pacts with the Soviet Union and Hitler, which sort of worked for a short while. There were agreements, with Sweden, with Finland, all sorts of agreements. There were attempts to have agreements with the UK, which held up only for a short while. So, when people say, well, there's no point in studying diplomacy and arms control because they don't work, they kind of ignore that whether they work or not, they happen. And if you want to understand what can go wrong, you got to read and understand it. So, for those of you who have the hawkish view that you shouldn't bother with this because it doesn't work, I would urge you to rethink what you're thinking. Whether it works or not, you need to pay attention to it. Uh, what is you may not be interested in diplomacy, but diplomacy is interested in you. So you might as well pay attention. So that's the first argument. I think there's a more substantive and constructive argument, though, because that's kind of edgy and negative. Um, I think people do die. This is the other thing. People lack imagination about the future. They think, well, Putin and Xi aren't going to agree, and therefore, what's the point of investing time thinking about this? In your lifetime, they will pass. When Stalin died, it was a big deal. When Hitler died, it was a big deal. And a lot of things happened that wouldn't otherwise happen when they died. Heads up. You should at least have a death watch, number one. And number two, when it does occur, I think this history will be helpful in adjusting something that I think is a bit out of whack. In the beginning, and we will see this in today's lecture, people who thought about the international control of nuclear energy thought about it in terms that we have gotten out of the habit of thinking about. Well, what am I talking about? Does anybody know what vertical versus horizontal proliferation is? You can be wrong. Raise your hand, take a stab. We won't move until you do. Okay, Mr. Bolts.
Hi, vertical proliferation is when a state starts developing nuclear weapons. Horizontal proliferation is when other states start developing nuclear weapons, usually from state sponsors.
Start over slowly. What was the first one?
Vertical proliferation is when a state starts developing nuclear weapons or they increase their nuclear weapons program.
You want to focus on the latter. It's when a state that has nuclear weapons increases the number and quality. Okay.
Yep.
And what's the second one? The second one sounded right.
Horizontal proliferation is when other states start developing nuclear weapons, usually from the sponsorship from another state or help from another state.
The latter is surplusage. It's when more than one state tries to acquire, and the technology, if you will, spreads horizontally, right, to other countries. And you're right. It isn't surplus. You're right. It is sponsorship in a sense. It comes from someplace. Although, yeah, well, it has. It comes from someplace. They usually have help. Someone helps someone else get it. All right. Well, that's very useful to get clarity on, because in the early days, the 40s and 50s, people who were in the business of nuclear arms control were concerned to address both forms of proliferation, vertical and horizontal. And when they made proposals, the proposals spoke to both problems. Somewhere in the 60s, we got a little exhausted and cut corners. And we wanted only to address what Russia was doing, and in specific, try to limit the quality and quantity of weapons they had, and we engaged in negotiation, cut deals. The horizontal proliferation stuff was left to others. It was not the top drawer assignment anymore, if you will. The second tier diplomats got stuck with the horizontal proliferation. First tier worked vertical. And I think that view is still somewhat dominant today. The reason we say the arms control doesn't have much of a future, or for the moment it's on ice, is, well, arms control must mean dealing with Putin and Xi, and they don't like us, and things aren't working, and therefore arms control has, no immediate prospect. I find that might be a little reckless, and the reason why is we're seeing it today. How many of you? We'll take a poll. How many of you think the first nuclear war? Let's assume there will be one. I mean, there may not be, by the way, but if there was going to be a nuclear war, how many of you think it would be more likely that it would be started between the following countries: India and Pakistan, North or South Korea, Israel and Iran than between the major powers? Show of hands. Well, I got 1, 2. By the way, we are going to keep score. You all have to
Wait,
vote.
so we're voting now for non-major powers?
Yeah, that they would be more likely to be the first movers, if you will, of a
Okay.
nuclear war. Well, I suppose the beauty of this is that anyone who hasn't voted has voted by saying, well, I think the opposite is the case. Okay. So what's the score? Do we have how many
think
hands went up?
Between the hands and the chat, it's about half, so maybe 11 people.
Okay. Well, I like that. That's good. By the way, nobody knows. There's not a right or wrong answer. But if the half of the class that put their hands up is right, that's interesting. I don't sense that we talk about that at all. And I don't see, a whole lot of diplomacy being exhausted in trying to prevent that, as compared to somehow controlling the stockpiles of China, Russia, and the United States. Now, maybe that needs to be adjusted, would be the argument. And so going back and looking at this history when they were connected, that vertical and horizontal proliferation, might give us some hints. Now, there's a bit of a problem historically, and I encountered this when I wrote my first book. And the problem is, how do you do a critical history of arms control or nonproliferation? Just think about it for a moment. If a treaty or an agreement works, presumably nothing happens. History isn't about nothing, it's always about something. And, it's a counterfactual to argue, well, something didn't happen because this happened. It would give any historian a headache. There is a workaround, and I'd like to think I discovered it. But I would think anyone else with an average brain could figure this out as well as me. Each of the diplomats that went about the business of proposing or initiating talks to do arms control limits or prevent the spread of nuclear weapons horizontally had a vision of what they were trying to achieve. And that was tied to a problem that needed to be solved. Well, what was the problem? It was a war that they wanted to prevent, a war that would be fought in a certain way with certain weapons. In this case, well, nuclear weapons. Well, missiles, I suppose bombers, submarines now. All right. If you get the vision of the next war right, generally, if you get the problem right, the solutions probably will be better than if you get the problem wrong. If you don't understand what the problem is and you start solving that problem, there's an even chance it'll be irrelevant or worse, aggravate the real problem. You can see where I'm going. What we're going to do is take a look at past arms control efforts and ask what nuclear military scenario or threat were they trying to mitigate, and whether that was a very realistic scenario in the first place. Number one. And number two, we'll take a look at what they proposed to do and whether it helped or hurt or was impractical. Yeah. All right. Now we're ready to go open the slides. What's the first slide? All right. Well, I think we took care of number one. Why bother? Okay. What did the authors of the very earliest initiatives, and we'll go through these, the Acheson Lilienthal report and its twin diplomatic offering or brother, the Baruch plan, what did they see as the next war scenario that needed to be avoided? And the after the Baruch plan, Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, and the what he called, or his diplomats called, the logical projection and follow through, which roughly was the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. How did their nuclear threat perceptions change their views of which nuclear activities and materials were safe? Not change. What materials and nuclear activities were safe or dangerous, and how they should be controlled, and how sound were their nuclear threat perceptions and their policy prescriptions to avoid the worst. So those are the questions, and you can see why. I've sort of explained, this is how you do critical history. To my knowledge, no one had done a critical history of arms control. That's one of the reasons I had to write a book, because I couldn't find anything to teach with. You would get books that would tell you, well, this happened, that happened, this happened, or they'd be ideological. This is always good, or this is always bad, but not really a serious critical history. All right, next slide. Well, I'd like to think we ought to be rediscovering that nuclear restraint requires controlling both civil and military nuclear activities and holdings. With regard to what the Atoms for Peace and Baruch plan and Acheson Lilienthal report focused on, the Baruch plan and the Acheson Lilienthal report, as we'll see, feared that few nuclear weapons, if you just had a few, you could always win if you went first. You would target cities. There'd be no defense, and at the end of the day, you'd wipe out the urban areas, which, if you want to do a history of the world civilization, it's about urbanization. The world has increasingly over time become centered in cities, and that's where the opera is. There was no opera out in the countryside. You need cities for civilization, actually. And that may be changing, but that's been the history for the last few thousand years. In any case, you wipe those out, it's Mad Max. By the way, show of hands, is there anybody that's never heard or seen Mad Max films? That's reassuring. Well, that's what really. Well, you've got to watch at least one. You don't have to. There's no dialogue, so it's really quite good. It moves quite quickly, and then you'll understand that they were afraid that with nuclear use, you'd end up in a world like Mad Max. All right, the Atoms for Peace feared something a little different. They didn't think a few weapons was the issue. They said an arsenal that would be able to wipe out 100 of America's largest cities. And this could entail anywhere between several hundred to tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, depending on the quality of your air defense. That was a little bit different than the Baruch and Acheson Lilienthal report and plan. Now, how well did they go? How did that shape the control efforts of these first two efforts? Well, if you think the world's going to come to an abrupt halt, and you really, enjoy, listening to operas by Puccini, you're probably going to have some really tight controls in mind to prevent nuclear activities and the production of nuclear materials that you fear might result in bombs. If you think, on the other hand, as Atoms for Peace did, that, well, it's hundreds or tens of thousands of weapons we got to worry about, you'll have a more relaxed approach to controls. And you'll only focus on preventing very large military diversions that would possibly be militarized to threaten the destruction of 100 American cities rather than just a handful. All right. Is there more? I don't think there is. That's the Gentleman C lecture, I think. What do we got here? What's the next slide? Oh, there's more. Okay, how did, to what extent did they get kind of carried away? At least these first two efforts. Well, I think, you know, by downplaying the prospect of or the possibility of nuclear deterrence and the utility of defenses against nuclear air attacks, um, and focusing so much on cities, there was an overly tight view of what was necessary, an intense fear and distrust of the Soviets, which I think made agreeing to any controls impractical. Of course, given that Stalin was who you were dealing with, I think the idea that you get any agreement ever was a little loony. But there would have been more discussion of what was sound in the Acheson Lilienthal report. But what they did is they went so far, the Soviets more or less said "niet" and walked out of the room. So you didn't get that discussion. That's a shame because there's a lot in the Acheson Lilienthal report. It's not only clever, but probably right. And well, no, not probably, clearly right. And we don't hold ourselves to those standards enough. Maybe we should. So we still have to look at it. The Answer Peace program, as you can tell from my last comments, ignored how just a few weapons it would take to knock out the handful of strategic air command bases that we had initially, or how one or two weapons could possibly be used, let's say, in a war in the Middle East between Israel and someone else, and drag us into a war. And something we might want to think about starting now, as we worry about Iran getting nuclear weapons pretty quickly here. I mean, it could happen. How does that story end? And of course, just an accident would be pretty awful. That could be with just one weapon. And an accident could catalyze a war because people might not see it as an accident. They think it was an intentional attack. Anyway, because they paid too little attention to how a few weapons might matter, they didn't pay enough attention to small diversions and how small diversions might matter. They focused too much on large diversions. Not good. By the way, that's the system we have today. It unconsciously now it doesn't quite understand it, but it's geared more for detecting large diversions than the small diversions that I suspect we need to be worried much more about than previously, because technology has made it possible to make weapons out of much less material than people think, on the one hand, and on the other hand, one or two weapons going off could ruin your entire afternoon. And so we need to think about how little it would take to have a really bad nuclear event. And I don't think when the IEA was stood up in the 50s, they thought that way enough. All right, let's get into it. By the way, are there any questions or comments even at this introductory stage? All happy campers. Okay, let's bowl ahead. All right, what do they see as the threats? We'll go over this. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, I think we have this very well signposted. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, well, these, roughly are well, you might add an additional one. After Hiroshima, we feared the next war would be similar. And, that's a natural thing. Well, whoever strikes first would win. Arguably, people thought, and I think there's a strong argument that the nuclear use in Nagasaki and Hiroshima precipitated the end of the war. There are no defenses. The bomber or missile would always get through. Cities would be the main target. I think what we'll see is the scientist movement adopted this view, And I think this was the view of almost everyone, whether they were on the left or the right. Most people, and not everyone. There were smarter people who saw through some of the fallacies of these assertions. But in any case, it was a common view. Let's go to the next slide. Now, even before the weapon was used, Jay Jeffries, who worked at the Met Lab, which was the University of Chicago, filed a report that he hoped the Manhattan Project would take seriously. One of his key paragraphs has left an indelible stain on our thinking, and it's worth kind of reading. And that is that nuclear weapons favor the aggressor, and if you thought Blitzkrieg was scary, hang on, this is much worse. It would wipe out even the largest nation, or at least all of its production centers. You'll see that come up again in Atoms for Peace. Focus on production centers, which is the 100 largest American cities, they thought, and decide the issue on the first day of the war. Now, this prose in red, I'm going to read out loud. If two people are in a room 100 by 100 feet and they have no weapon except their bare fists, the attacker has only a slight advantage over his opponent. You can see that. Now, how many movies have you seen where someone gets hit in the face, but gets up off the ground and takes the other guy down nonetheless? So hitting first isn't necessarily the end of the game. But if each of them has a machine gun in his hand, the attacker is sure to be victorious. With the production of nuclear bombs, the world situation approaches that of two men with machine guns in a 1 by 100 foot room. And that image really seized on a lot of minds. Let's go to the next one. There may be a reference not only to the Jeffries report. Well, go back. There was another report that was filed. Hold on here. Let me see if I can conjure up from the notes. The Frank report, which went to the administration and just go to the Manhattan Project, went to Secretary of War. And he had recommended, because of the similar views he had with Jay Jeffries, Dr. Frank was also with the Met Lab at the University of Chicago. They both believed in those three assumptions. And as a result, Dr. Frank recommended a demonstration shot or keeping the very existence of the nuclear weapon secret. Now, you can well imagine how well that was received. They said, yeah, thanks for your advice. Go away. And they used the weapon. Partly, they wanted to end the war, and they thought this would help. And there were a lot of people dying on the American side that they wanted that to stop. And they contemplated casualties, rightly or wrongly, to be really very high if they continued the war. Not only that, but even Oppenheimer rationalized it. Well, if we use the bomb, it'll show everyone how dangerous it is, and it'll convince them to engage in international control. I mean, I think that was a post ad hoc ratio, but bottom line is this advice was not listened to. Next slide. They went ahead, they used the bomb, but as soon as they did, they adopted most of the arguments of the scientist movement, which was based at the University of Chicago. For what it's worth, the University of Chicago, I went there. The Met Lab was in the chemistry building, based there, and for quite some time, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was the journal of the scientist movement, was based in the basement. And I know this because I went there and read journals because it was the only place you could get any of the nuclear trade journals. The library didn't, Regenstein didn't hold them. But the scientist movement, and they were, really quite, let's say, progressive. I'm being gentle. Um, became mainstream. I mean, this is what's very interesting. After the use of the bomb, the arguments that were pushed aside with regard to the practical advice that they were giving was adopted. So you have this statement, November 15th, 1945, by the three heads of state of the three nations in the Manhattan Project. And essentially, the statement is very brief, but they say there is no defense against nuclear weapons. Civilization salvation required international control, which was, world government. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was the League of Nations focused on nuclear things, and we needed to do this to share, useful civilian applications without risk of military diversion. These propositions were all contained in the Frank and Jeffries report, and so they said, okay, we've used it, but now we need to control it, and we buy everything that you've argued, and here it is. Okay, next slide. Now, it went further than just making a statement. President Truman called for the study immediately of how to do this. How would you get international control? And he tapped Dean Acheson, who's Under Secretary of State, later became Secretary of State, and David A. Lilienthal, who ran the TVA. Does anybody know what, again, the connection between the Tennessee Valley Authority and nuclear weapons might be?
Didn't they create the first refining facilities were in the TVA?
Well, they had to
TVA
be.
power.
And why did they have to be? Refinement, I think you want to use the word enrichment, but yes.
Yes, enrichment. Excuse me.
Why did that need to be anywhere near the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority?
A lot of consistent hydropower.
They needed a lot of electricity. Remember that after the war in the 50s, that facility used 10% of the electricity produced nationally. Just to run the darn thing. So it was a logical collection of people, but they really didn't write the report. What's the next slide? He did. He did. Now take a look at this guy. Do you think for any moment at all this fellow didn't look in the mirror before he would go outside? I mean, if that isn't somebody with an ego, he's Indiana Jones, for Christ's sake. Look at
It helps when you win the genetic lottery and have his eyes.
Well, but it's more than that. He's got the hat, the cigarette. This is a man who had a sense of drama. Okay? And when you go read about him or you go see movies about it, don't ever forget that. I think Einstein had a proper read of the guy. He needed to hyperventilate and get out and stop trying to be the center of attention. In a sense, he did this in a way that made him a target. There was a terrific piece, and I say this even though I've been one of his critics, by William Broad. Did anyone see it? Someone go type in William Broad, New York Times, Oppenheimer. Do you see anything? Is there an article?
There was an article from 3 days ago on the New York Times.
Yes.
It's an
Share that with everybody.
Okay.
It's a terrific. It goes to the question: was he a communist or not? And the short answer is probably. he played very close to the edge. This was a man who pushed the envelope, okay, in his life and everything. Very interesting man. And apparently, he was extremely good as director at Los Alamos. Not just sort of good, extremely good, because he knew how to deal with difficult physicists, genius, annoying academic personalities. He was extremely agile. He probably was the best person to run the project, but he had some personality quirks. In any case, this was a man who was gunning for world attention. If you take a look at his education, he was educated in Great Britain, the United States, and Berlin. This is a man of the world. This is not your average guy. All right, he had the pen more than anyone else. And we'll see him also in Atoms for Peace. He had the pen in a way for that program unwittingly. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Very important personality. If you read about him, you learn a lot about America and the nuclear policies that we have. All right. So let's go to the next slide. Anyway, I love that picture. It captures him, unfortunately, better than any other I've ever seen. All right. What are the premises? Well, they mirror the scientist movement. Surprise, surprise. So, I pulled some of these things from the report. The report is very clumsy, tedious, difficult, and boring to read. As a result, most people quote from it, but have never bothered to read it. So if you really want to be dangerous in Washington, you might read it. I remember there was someone, I'm going to protect his name because you'll know who it is, someone extremely important and extremely senior who came to a gathering and said, everyone should read the Acheson Lilienthal report. He says, if you read it, you discover that you can have peaceful nuclear power and have disarmament. And of course, he never read the report completely. There was an addendum that said that was wrong, and we'll get to that. And I just broke out in laughter when he said this in front of all these people. He was beating his breast. I said, well, yeah, you ought to read it too, all of it. They don't. If you do, you could be a problem. You can go to gatherings and be annoying to some great extent. In any case, they bought into the scientist movement, and so the weapons of strategic bombardment aimed at the destruction of enemy cities and the eradication of their populations. That's what nuclear weapons are about. And I think we need to keep that in mind because there's a tendency today to think of them as, breaking up tunnels and deep targets and all that. And they do. And that, if there is a proper application, I think there is, that's what it ought to be. But they weren't invented for that reason. They were invented to bust cities, and they still can. And that's a problem because they still might. Anyway, they thought that was the only use for them, which I don't think is correct. There can be no adequate military defense against atomic weapons. Well, we've gone through that might not be true, but that's what they believed. And the uncontrolled development of nuclear energy would only intensify the ferocity of warfare, but could directly contribute to the outbreak. This is a little bit like inanimate objects made me do it. It's, I suppose, you get this argument with arms, with gun control, right? Some people believe if you have guns, they produce these killings. Other people say, no, the killings are a result of deranged minds. Well, they've sided with, you don't want these things around. It brings out the worst in people. And then only international ownership of what they call dangerous nuclear facilities materials and controls over all the other activities that might become that with intrusive inspections, could avert the worst. All of this came from roughly the Frank report and the Jeffries report. Just whole sock. All right, let's go to the next page. All right.